In the month of July 2023, I started a 10-gallon aquarium. I went out into the lake and shoveled out some dirt. It doesn't look like much at the moment, but that lake soil is filled with tons of microorganisms and organic waste generated by the animals that inhabit that local body of water. This video will tell the story of the 10-gallon aquarium and all of its inhabitants. This will be mostly an unscripted video, since it is the first time I ever really do this kind of thing, and I'm unsure if I'll ever do any of this again, but here I am. For starters, an ecosphere is mostly used to refer to a small jar that contains a sample from an outside body of water, usually found in a local system such as a river or a lake, and you just isolate it probably like next to a window, and you just let it develop by itself. You throw some algae and some plants in there, and you just watch life prosper or die by itself. And I suppose I always wanted to recreate some of that process at a much larger scale, such as a 10-gallon, but eventually the project became more hands-on and basically just became another aquarium. The early stages of this 10-gallon aquarium was honestly a mess. There was just all that mud everywhere, just water was super cloudy. But in the soil I was able to find right off the bat some bladder snails, some Tubifex worms, amphipods / Scuds, and even a diving beetle. If I were to go back and actually change anything about the foundation process of making this aquarium, I probably would have followed a bit more of the father fish method and would have capped off that soil with some sand, to prevent all of that soil from just getting everywhere on the water current at a slight disturbance. So instead, I just had to do a ton of water changes and sacrifice a ton of all those microorganisms that would have been beneficial early on. The heart of this experiment revolves around the mindset of embracing all of the aspects of nature, especially all the gross and icky aspects of it, such as worms, microorganisms, algae especially. And honestly, the best mindset to approaching an aquarium or any kind of a natural setup is that if there's something out of control, don't see it as a problem that needs to be get rid of, but see it more as an untapped resource. Everything exists for a reason, and everything can be eaten by something else. And if you have a lot of algae, then that's just a good excuse to perhaps introduce an organism that can feed on it and reproduce on it. Unless you're doing a more traditional aquarium, where that algae can be a result of poor water parameters or excess nutrients. After several water changes and waiting for all that silt to settle down, the tank was finally visible all the way to the back. And this was the opportunity for me to finally start introducing plants in order to, let's say, tap into that resource that is that lake soil. Some of the plants that I have chosen for this tank are root feeders. Root feeders have proven to be the most viable for this kind of setup because they are able to, they primarily feed on nutrients inside of the soil because they are root feeders, and they can also reproduce a lot more reliably through runners, which is why the plant that I have chosen for this setup, the primary plant, is Dwarf Sagittaria. The main organisms that I have introduced into this aquarium will be the least Killifish and dwarf Crayfish from the Gammarus genus. I figured these small animals will be suited best for this setup because of their small size, so they are able to have more space and reliably sustain themselves on the environment of the aquarium. I also have a particular bias for these specific animals due to their brown, naturalistic colors, and also because of their scarcity in the aquarium market. Not a lot of people are out there selling least killifish or dwarf Cajun crawfish, and I am hoping that someday there will be more aquarists actively breeding these types of animals to make them more readily available and not as expensive as they are right now. Upon the introduction of these least killifish and the dwarf crayfish, I think is where the ecosphere aspect of this project really died. Because the presence of fish and these scavengers and opportunistic predatory crayfish started to really kill off some of the native Tubifex worms and the amphipods, Daphnia, copepods, because of their active predation. And even then, the biggest offender were really the dwarf crayfish, because not only are they preying on the small crustaceans, but they will actually try to eat some of the least killifish if they get the chance, whether they're asleep or they get too close. And I think the best way that I could have reduced any kind of predation was just by having a larger setup, around like 30 or 20 gallons, so that the crayfish and the least killifish would have more space to avoid each other. And then I wouldn't have to spend so much money buying least killifish multiple times just to replenish their lost numbers. Now, in terms of the killifish, well, they're not actual killifish, they're actually more live bearers, more closely related to guppies, but despite being live bearers, their reproduction rate wasn't as quick as I anticipated. I've only really gotten like at least 2 or 3 babies per month, and even then a lot of those babies would either like disappear, or really it was very difficult to tell who was a fry and who was an adult anymore because of how small these fish are. But despite that, I think they're very neat fish. The reason why their reproduction rate is different from their guppy cousins is because they do something called superfetation, which basically they're a female when they give birth is more like an assembly line where they expel the offspring or fry as soon as it's fully developed inside of the female, as opposed to a guppy who lets go out of all of their fry once they're all developed at once, which is why people say that these fish would give birth to at least 1 fry per day. But I don't think I was able to get those kind of results due to the pressures of maybe not there wasn't enough food or protein that I didn't supply to them, because they were solely living off of algae and microorganisms, and as well as the predation from the crayfish. I would always start with like 15 least killifish, and overall it always just feels like there's 8 or less by the end of it. And there are even 2 incidents where the dwarf crayfish actually ate an entire sex to extinction inside of my aquarium. First they ate all of the females, and then the second time they ate all of the males. Another challenge I have faced when trying to balance this whole system was providing the algae in order for the animals to sustain themselves, and also trying to control that algae, because the algae can actually get cleaned up relatively quickly because of the killifish and the crayfish eating it. These dwarf crayfish actually did a really good job at eating an algae-covered piece of a stalk of a papyrus plant, which they were able to eat and break down over several weeks. And then there was the one time that I actually went to my college pond, and I took a clump of algae from that pond and introduced it into the aquarium. And ever since then, I've had just a big old lump of algae just floating at the top of the tank, blocking most of the light towards the lower plants, such as the root feeders, Dwarf Sagittaria, and trying to find a population of organisms that could actually trim down that kind of algae density. So I might be going back on my word about using algae as an untapped resource. But I've tried several things. I tried introducing additional scuds, which that didn't really work because of the presence of fish. The fish were just forcing the scuds to go underground, and then the crayfish would proceed to eat them and try to catch them with their claws. So that didn't work. So the next introductions of animals into the aquarium were primarily motivated to combat this algae breakout. First, I tried adding Amazon frogbit, a floating plant similar to duckweed but larger and less oppressive. And the second introduction was introducing some Panda Garra, which are a type of algae eater. The Panda Garrus actually did a pretty decent job cleaning up some of the algae that grows on the leaves of the Dwarf Sagittaria, as well as the glass, but they didn't really go after the large clump floating at the top of the surface. This just wasn't their feeding habit. Which is why the next animal that I introduced were a wild type dwarf shrimp, the Neocaridina. I was actually looking for like the genuine wild type of the brown coloration, but I got scammed multiple times on eBay and they just kept getting low grade red or blue shrimp. So I had to just settle for those and kept some of the shrimp as a breeding project that I'm able to sell to people. And now I have these shrimp that are pregnant in the tank and are about to breed. Something else that I also needed to point out about this aquarium is that I started out using a power filter, but eventually, as soon as the plant growth got dense and they were able to process some of those nutrients by themselves, I decided to remain filterless and let the plants act as the biofilter. Probably the biggest biofilter that I have right now is probably a combination of the algae and some of the roaming hornwort and Anacharis plant, as well as this small papyrus plant that I also stole from my college campus and introduced it into my tank, and also indirectly introduced a population of diving beetles, some insect nymphs and larvae, as well as some additional microcrustaceans such as ostracods and daphnia. But a lot of those invertebrates eventually died off because they were eaten by the fish, the crayfish, and a lot of the insect larvae eventually metamorphosed into adult insects such as this damselfly. And I really think we are reaching a point where I've been rambling on about the tank for a little too long and didn't really have a lot of time for the footage to settle for like the people to actually watch this go down. So I guess I can talk about some of like why haven't I really uploaded anything for the past several years, starting around 2016 where my content really started to slow down, since I used to be a Gmod animator and that's where I really got a lot of my traction subscriptions. But ever since I got moved into a private high school, it just started taking my time, and I guess I started losing a lot of motivation, especially around the time the algorithm started to change, and got really demotivated on working on my YouTube channel. And probably the worst thing that really happened to me was one question: is it worth making? I felt like I had to filter a lot of my ideas into something that could be professional grade or something that could work towards my future career, but that kind of mindset really never really got me anywhere. And ever since I graduated with a bachelor's on animation and digital filmmaking, I never really broke out of that slump. If anything, ever since I graduated and got into that COVID lockdown, I started to realize how alone I really am. So now I'm currently studying a minor degree on fish and wildlife conservation to see where my life is going to take me now. There's no real guarantee that this career path is going to make me financially sustainable, or if I'll ever find any kind of success, but maybe for once I'll actually find something that makes me happy again. And if you're watching, anybody that's been watching me since back in the Gmod days and are watching me now, thank you for sticking around.